Good evening and welcome to what is our last of the Vision Days video podcasts. So if this is the first one you've taken part in, I encourage you to go back and take a look. I don't know exactly how many there are, but it's been one for every Wednesday, June, July, and August. So that must be about 13.
Well, and happy September.
Oh yeah, it's September 1st, so that must be maybe 14. The topic tonight is kind of an overarching topic of the growing young conversation that we've been hitting pieces of throughout the summer, and this is kind of the one that hopefully brings it all together. Pastor Corey here at First Lutheran.
Tim Megorden, retired campus pastor in a variety of different settings, presently on the Synod Candidacy Committee, so dealing with emerging youth leadership as well as professional leadership in the church. So really excited and interested in this growing young piece.
I'm Tyler Bublitz. I'm the Director of Youth and Family Ministries here at First Lutheran Church.
You bet. And the reason the three of us are sitting here is because a year ago, so must have been August of 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, we were invited to take part in a 2 or 3 day educational piece where this was the grounding of it, the growing young. And they have repeated that since, and so Pastor Emily could just as well be up here too. She took part of it took part in it in August of this year. But let's start. I told you as we were just talking that I thought let's start with a little bit of Bible here, and it might seem like an odd place to begin, but it's 2 Chronicles, and it's Solomon's conversation with God at the outset of his ministry. And you, working with candidacy, you work with leaders at the outset of their ministry. But I think this is just such an important time in the church. It is as if we are at the beginning, again, of our ministry. Because things could look radically different and for a reason, for a purpose. So, that night, God appeared to Solomon, and God said, "What do you want from me? Ask." Now, I'm reading from the Message translation of the Bible. Solomon answered, "You were extravagantly generous with David, my father, and now you have made me king in his place. Establish the work that you started with him, and guide me with the wisdom that you spoke with him. For you give me wisdom and knowledge, so that I may rule in a good way your good people." And God answered Solomon, "This is what has been placed on your heart to say. You didn't grasp for glory. You didn't grasp for honor or riches or the demise of your enemies. Instead, you asked for wisdom and knowledge, and it is that I give you." As we embark on this conversation of growing young, it is in a way, the more I get into it, kind of a Reformation moment for us as a church. Because if you think about what happened during the Reformation, Martin Luther looked around and he noticed that, in a way, his church had left the people behind. And the service was in a language that the people didn't speak. the only ones who were able to read Scripture or to really know anything about Scripture that wasn't coming through the lips of the priests were the elite, the elected. And it was there that God inspired Martin Luther to bring the Word of God into the language of the people, which also brought worship into the language of the people. And we are at a moment now in the church where, for some, and especially I think for the young, the stories they've heard about the church are usually stories that didn't reflect the church very well. It was the gripes about the church. And what's interesting about this generation is denominations aren't significant in that the average person doesn't know that there is a difference between a Lutheran or a Presbyterian or a Baptist or a Pentecostal or a Roman Catholic. And so when something happens in the world that is negative in one branch of the Christian church, all of the Christian church gets branded with that sin or that problem. And so the times that the church ends up in the news typically are the negative times. And so the view of the church from the outside can be very negative. And we have responsibility in that too. We haven't been doing a good job of telling the story of who we are. And so what the growing young conversation seems to be all about is it's not a program. There is no program that can save the Christian church.
No.
It's about, once again, establishing the relationship of Jesus and God's people. And that's going to make us look a lot different in the future, I think.
Yeah, I was talking with you guys before this. I think a great example of this is Yellowstone over the last 30 years. You had a major fire go through Yellowstone, drastically changed the landscape. And in doing that, because there weren't any wolves, elk dominated and just took over. And if you even look back to the writings of like Aldo Leopold was talking about thinking like a mountain, there's a great essay where he talks about coming from a mountain's perspective, if you don't have any top predators, how it changes things and erodes things away. And when you look back to the different documents talking about Yellowstone, there was all this work that needed to be done. We're talking millions upon billions of dollars of restoration of rivers and planting trees and all this. And in 1995, they released wolves back into Yellowstone. And it wasn't instant. But over 10, 15, 20 years, Yellowstone's a totally different place. Now, is it bad that it's different than what it was? No. It's a healthier place than it was. And it's really interesting because in the same way, it's us as biologists, as people who are out in the world, understanding the relationship that top predators have with not only their prey and the ecosystem itself, but how much that also is part of us. And I think in a lot of ways, the church is the same way. There's a whole gap that we have right now, and it doesn't matter where you're looking. As a corporate church, we're missing a major section in the conversation. And that's going to help guide where the church really needs to be. The church is more our high school youth than it is mine. And the church is more mine than it is yours. And I think it's that we have to embody that. And that's part of what this is then if that's the case, let's make sure that we're establishing those relationships so that those things that we've learned along the way can be transferred, but it also allows us to listen to what people who are maybe newer into the faith are also saying, but have you thought about this? And I think that's where it's so important having those in the same space, in the same building. And I think in a lot of ways, that's one of the things our community as a whole is crying for, is to get those places where we're talking back and forth instead of arguing back and forth.
One of the things that's exciting for me when we think about a sort of spiritual Yellowstone and the change or the Reformation is if you will, the change of leadership just within the Bemidji community. I think of Emily Papke Larson, a person of this community who grew up in this community. I think of Mika McCracken, who right now is in Chicago and is the executive director of innovation for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. These are people, I think of you, Tyler, these are people that can help us move into a kind of movement, if you will, a change of culture relative to growing young, and how important that is and how exciting that is, and how we intergenerationally can support that move. When I think about the book and I think about the research and the conversations we've had, for me, growing young is sort of reclaiming what it means to be a baptized community. And it starts in the ELCA tradition in infancy, when we we splash water and we put word to that and we invite not only that child but that family as well as the broader faith family into a kind of movement of living in God's grace, which is remarkably broad and diverse and exciting and different regardless of where we are in that journey, but that there is something at the core of what it means to be a people of faith, a community of faith, that drives who we are and where we belong and what God's purpose is for us in daily life.
You know, I think virtually any biblical scholar wouldn't and isn't screaming and yelling, "This is the end of the world. The church has never been so terrible as it is right now," because the biblical legacy that we see all throughout Scripture is this ebb and flow of the faithful. And to me, we are repeating the sins of the past, repeating the ebb and the flow of the past. But for me as a leader in the church, and that's the piece that Solomon touches, is yes, I know that, but I'm not going to stand alongside and say, well, this is just the normal ebb and flow of church faithfulness. No, God give us the knowledge and wisdom to be the up rather than continue to be a piece of the down. And so let the bottom be now and let the future be bright. And for that we need God's wisdom and guidance. We don't need to talk about the lengthiness of our lives or the fame of First Lutheran or any of that. It is all about, God give us the knowledge and the wisdom to be faithful and to awaken a Reformation, to reawaken a Yellowstone, to move forward.
To give our faith legs. Mm-hmm. I can't speak on the behalf of the youth because I would say in a way I'm not quite their generation, but
in their eyes you're not.
You're an elder.
I'm old, but I think about even the last 10 years of my life and how I'm sitting in this chair and into this place is a lot of my story is, well, this isn't right, and my faith is strong, and I just got to figure out how to make this work. And, and I've talked about this even with my wife. Like, for me, instead of just pushing it away because it's hard, for me it's like, well, then let me go in and fix it. Let me go and be part of the solution to help get through this. And that's probably partially my just DNA with that. But I think that's also partially where, in a lot of ways, we're at as a church. And I've thought this through a couple different times. One of the biggest flaws that I feel like we have as humans is we love holding on to what we know. And there's good things about that. But then it makes it hard to grasp something new. And so it's that moment of, and I feel in a lot of ways that's where we're at in the church. We have a lot of great things that we do. But it's figuring out, like, what is the things we really, really want to hold on to? What are the things where it's like, well, let's set this aside, just to the side, it's a quick grab. And what are the things where it's like, this is not speaking to us the same way that it used to? That maybe we need to put it aside for a while to let new life come in, and we still might come back and grab it at some point.
Oh, we will, because remember the ebb and flow.
We'll grab it
it will come back.
Or in a different form. Allow the possibility for change to happen. And I catch myself in that. Well, this is the way that I've known life. Well, maybe it's okay to reimagine and relook at that. And that's part of the gift of youth, is because they don't have that baggage. Let the little children come to me. Let me see it through their eyes, because they don't have this baggage of this is what we know coming into it. Everything's fresh, everything's new, and I would find that even when I did solar presentations and talking about energy and how, talk to a third grader and how you think alternative energy sources. They talk to you about lightning power, like, let's harness lightning. Well, if you can figure that out, that'd be amazing. But it's their creativity. Let's get wolves on treadmills. I remember having a kid tell me that. Well, that's a great idea, but how do we do that? Getting that type of energy even into the church setting. That let's let young people let their minds just run free. What that could be. What could that look like? And reimagine then what church really is all about.
So our task is to get there. And I know you've got 3 pieces that you've kind of boiled us down to, but as kind of a to what you're going to say, I've written down here, church has changed. And what we as leaders of the church are seeing is that our young families, it used to be the tradition that we may lose touch with a member of the congregation when they go to college until they're married and have children. And then they typically are back in the church, wanting their children to go to Sunday school. Well, the generations now have been so marginalized, I would say, that the coming back is more like just coming back for Christmas and Easter. Not because they're Christmas and Easter worshipers, but that for them is coming back because they're not in a pattern of worshiping weekly. We're not seeing young families bring their children at 3 years old to do cradle roll call, isn't that what it used to be called?
Yes.
Where the starting of their Sunday school years. And then we'd see them again at First Communion, and we'd see them again at Confirmation. But we would see them come back, and we're not seeing them coming at 3 years old. And we're not seeing them at First Communion. We sometimes see brand new kids at Confirmation, but even there, a lot of the folks that their parents were confirmed, their grandparents were confirmed, we're not seeing them, and so now they're in college, and they haven't had any contact with the church, and to them, a close contact feels like going to Christmas service, because it's so different, or going to Easter service. So that's not to be, miserable about. That's just to acknowledge that's our starting point. And where do we go from here? And that's where I think your pieces come so well in.
I would preface it by a conversation that actually Mika McCracken had with Carrie Miller on Minnesota Public Radio about 3 weeks ago. And there was also a Jewish rabbi from the East Coast that was a part of that. It was a great conversation. But a term that came up there that I hadn't heard before, hadn't thought about, but it's been rumbling around in my head, is spiritual homelessness. There are a whole bunch of people right now who have a history, but have been, if you will, on the streets spiritually. And they have not been able to find a sense of home. And I think a part of what we think about in baptism is that it is a movement of making the faith community a home for us to live daily life. Here's the challenge I have as an elder, is knowing as we grow this growing young movement, when to speak and when to listen. I think you were talking about that a little while ago. That those wonderful moments of harnessing the electricity in the air of a storm. I mean, young people have these marvelous ideas that we, if we listen to, one, we might learn from them, but two, listening, we know, creates a deeper sense of investment in the daily life of the community. 3 questions that I think are core to this movement, if you will. Question of who am I? Focused on our identity. Where do I fit? Wondering about my belonging, those things that nurture me in my daily life. And then, what difference do I make? That sense of purpose and mission and focus for what I can do for the betterment, for the growth of the community. I think those 3 questions are really important for us to ask, and then to deeply listen to people across the generation scale, if you will, to find out for them who they are, how they belong, and what their purpose is in daily life. And then I think that's really important, to do that organizationally as a church, that we ask the question, who are we as Lutheran, ecumenical Christian people of faith in this neighborhood, in the Bemidji area? Where do we fit? And who do we belong to? And are those likely partnerships or unlikely partnerships? And then how together do we find mission and purpose in our daily life, both within this gathering place, this sanctuary, if you will, but meaning and purpose out there across this greater Bemidji area, and also nationally and internationally in terms of our mission.
You know, I think you've touched on something really important, and when you brought up those 3 things, I started thinking, because those are questions that have been identified that are that hole in young lives that they're trying to answer, to find who they are and fill themselves. And I started thinking back to myself growing up and where the church was in answering those. And in a way, the church wasn't asking those questions of me or helping me find the answer. The church that I grew up in, and I'm not just talking about the church in my little hometown, I'm talking about the church, was more about giving advice than drawing out life from someone. And so, but the community I grew up in, so small town, I had 22 in my graduating class. In my confirmation class, I had 14. In my town, we had 3 churches. So others of my classmates were Methodists, or others of my classmates were Roman Catholic. But there wasn't a classmate that wasn't connected, at least somehow, marginally, to confirmation or to a church. Well, that is not the case anymore. And I think part of the answer to why that is because the church that we were all growing up in was the information pipeline. It was given to us as, we know the answers, and you will listen and memorize the answers, and then you can be confirmed. Where the questions that you've drawn out of the book here as so important, the who am I, that was a question that we did wrestle with in ourselves. Didn't necessarily talk about it, but it is a question that resonates with me. The question about where do I belong, that was never a question posed to me or by me. I knew that I was a Lutheran. I knew that I belonged to the Lutheran Church in town. I knew that I was a child of God, for Sunday school had told me all that. Yeah. And then the question of what is my purpose, that came more from the struggle of college than the church and God's calling of us in vocation. It came for me out of Bible camp, but even there, I don't believe it was articulated as clearly as you've articulated it. It just happened for me that I started questioning my vocation and who I was being called to be. So I think, those 3 questions brought to a world that doesn't necessarily have the answers. And we're not asking the question so that we can sneak in the answer, Jesus, for every question. No. But to have the world know that we seriously want to wrestle with these questions in ourselves, and we believe that they are being called to wrestle with them alongside us.
The interesting thing I find with these questions is, and I've heard this a couple different places now, where psychologists are going through and asking people of different age demographics, how many best friends do you have at different ages? And the funny thing is as we're, over the last 50 years, or close people, it's getting smaller and smaller. And I think that's where, to me, that's part of the glimmer of hope that the church has. Is that we can, not just
you need to go a little further to explain it.
But I think it's one of the
we want to isolate you so that we can step in and fill you.
But this is a great opportunity, because that's what the church is relationships. It is working through that. If I was going to go through and answer those questions, some of those I still am wrestling with. Being still young in my profession, figuring out, what does this all mean? And that was something, for me, I remember getting done with college. No, I'll rewind before that. Going into my final semester of college, and I still look up to him greatly. He's like a father figure to me. And I was a biology major, wanted to do field biology, and really started pressing him on, why did you leave that? Why did you leave what I know was your dream to become a high school biology teacher? And the simple, and what boiled out of it was, I wanted to have a family. I wanted to be a dad. And in order for me to do that, when I was looking at the demands of the job, I knew it was going to put too much of a strain on my marriage to be able to do that. And for me, I was then trying to process this of okay, I'm a person that, yes, that's something I want. And yes, I want to be an active part of my congregation. And how do I do that if I'm getting pulled all these, and for me, it led to years trying to figure out, where do I fit? How do I have this strong faith and be able to satisfy this scientific part of my brain that I want to feed? And that's led into different parts of my life. But it's one of the things that I've tried doing, and I still feel that there's a lot of room for me to be able to work on, is getting to those questions of asking kids about, like, what is their future? What are you planning? What are your ideas and where you're wanting to go? Because I think that starts to open that door to, I want to be here with you in that. I've gone through things. I can give you what I experienced, some advice from what I've experienced, but it's still your decision.
So one of the chapters here was empathize with youth. And the statement that you just made, that over the last 50 years, our really close friendships, the amount of really close friendships that we claim has decreased significantly. And so then that's leaving us with a sense of isolation, which we can see in our world. I can see it in my life, and I can see it in remembering my parents' life. The social gatherings that happened in our homes were prevalent when I was young and minimalistic in my own adult life. So has been a shift. And I think what you meant, and I made a joke out of it, but the church needs to stand there as those close friendships.
Yes.
And say, we, as lovers of Jesus, want to invest in you.
And what happened to me today as we talked was there are just a whole bunch of stories that popped up for me of people integrally involved at First Lutheran in Bemidji who listened to me as a kid, were empathetic to me. I think of Phil Hofstede. I think of Ray Williams. I think of Steve Knutson. I think of Ted Peterson. I think of Earl Kearns, who helped me learn how to play saxophone and embedded in me a love of jazz. And I still am longing for a worship service that is deeply rooted in the jazz, whatever, beat, tone, whatever the case may be. But
I'm not opposed to it at all.
And
I think we would love it. It wouldn't probably be an everyday thing because we're not New Orleans.
No.
But an occasional would be awesome.
Yeah.
But, and in the same sense, I've got a deep desire for a service led by strings.
Yeah.
We've got a symphony orchestra in town. We've got a great high school orchestra program. We've got people who can play the strings. And man, I think it would be just powerful to have a service that's accompanied by the strings.
I'll tell you mine.
Drums.
No.
All drums.
Well, that's a whole other thing. But actually, mine would be, I would love to have a service led by people under 20. Because I think it would be really interesting to hear, what are they wrestling with? What would be the music that they would choose? How would they choose to play it? And I know from like my experience, when I was, a middle schooler and getting invited to be able to, asking and then being accepted into playing with the worship band, and how much that changed. Yeah. It changed my life for drumming forever. Because their gigs and stuff that I'm able to play now is partially because of somebody giving me that opportunity to play. Giving me the opportunity of, here's what you need to learn to be able to do this. And, the last couple of years recognizing it's like, you have been doing this more than half your life now. You've, at different points, been helping lead worship, usually behind some type of drum set. And for me, then being able to get most things that are going to sit in front of me and at least feel confident that I can get through it with everybody together. That's a whole different skill set. That's a whole thing that I learned, and it gives me a different confidence. Thinking about Tim, like what you were talking about, I remember in college, and bless his heart, he was a great pastor, but the pastor I grew up with at the end of his pastoral career, you could tell it was the end of his pastoral career. And yes, there was things that I wish that he would have dug into more in the sermon. But I was as much there for the coffee hour afterwards to go and talk with multiple different people because they cared. When I was home from college, they made a point to at least ask me how things were going, and they gave a rat's patootie. And from my confirmation class of like 8 of us, I would say I'm firmly the one that I can point to that's like still actively involved in a church week in, week out. There's some that are fringes and some that I feel like have pretty much walked away from it. And to me, when I was even walking into this call, that was the one thing that I knew was a separating factor for me, was I had multiple people who wanted to hear what was going on in Tyler's life, wanted to understand me, and was willing to have a conversation with me, not just because I was a youth, not just because my dad was the church president. They wanted to know me. Right. And I think, and that's been one of the things that I've been trying to work on here. And I think it's a key part for all of us to feel belonging. To have somebody willing to go out to lunch with you and just talk and let's hear what's going on with your life, what's new, what's different, making sure that connection is there, and that's even like dealing with kids as they're going through high school and thinking about what they're doing afterwards. What a great opportunity to be able to talk about, okay, I don't know where I'm going. Well, where in the country do you want to live? Where do you picture yourself? And getting into that frame of mind is actually, it's a lot of fun, and it's really fun to actually start talking with them. It's like, you have more figured out than you realize.
And I think the stories that I remember of those people that were mentors in my baptismal journey, I don't know that they ever asked me these 3 questions.
Right.
But they hung with me long enough. So I think they sort of led me into and participated with me in the working of those 3 questions. Who am I? Where do I fit? And who do I belong? And what is God's purpose in my life?
Yeah. So it wasn't directed at you. It was drawn out of you through their journey with you.
Right.
I think about I think about the pastors in my life. And of course, for me, most of those are in my younger life because I have been the pastor, and it's hard to be your own pastor. But it's not the messages, it's not their worship leadership that makes them the best pastor that I had. It's because I knew that they dearly loved God's people. Though that's the pastor that sticks out in my head. He dearly loved God's people, even though I fell asleep in his sermons.
The other thing I'll say too is you get to know those people at a different level than they otherwise show. For me, I have a pseudo-grandfather who passed away a couple years back, and at his funeral, I realized that I knew him better than the pastor did. Because the pastor was describing a side of him that I knew was there, but I didn't get to see. Because when he was around us, he was a lot more open. He would talk about us. And the thing is I gotten invited as an outsider, technically not blood, to different family functions of his, and then listening to his relatives talk about, oh yeah, he doesn't stop talking about you guys. Because he looked at me as a grandson. He looked at my sister as a granddaughter, even though he'd never had kids of his own. And so I just distinctly remember at that funeral, it's like, one, yes, I want a copy of that, but also realizing what sacred space I had been welcomed into that I didn't even know. Because the side of him that I gotten to see, the rest of the world didn't get to see. And so the different experiences and things that I had had with him was a changing experience of him and of me. And if that isn't the holy in and among us, I don't know what is. And I think that's an experience that we're all craving as a church, as a human being. I think we crave that. And if we deny ourselves that by not including or making sure that we're making a point of connecting with different generations, we're missing potentially understanding actually a part of who we are and what our calling is and who has God made us to be.
Don't you think the future for the community of faith is going to have at least some of those lines that we have drawn really firmly blurred, and that if we really take seriously growing young, that what is sacred and what is secular is going to move much more fluidly back and forth, and we're going to discover that there's amazingly sacred things in the middle of the public square.
Yes.
And that sort of thing. And that what is public and what is private is going to also, there's going to be some fluidity there, and there's going to be some blurring, and that we're going to need to be just comfortable not defining stuff through clear lines, but also knowing that the God of baptism, if you will, is present with us in all of life.
Yeah.
Sounds like you're describing Acts to a T.
Wow.
I mean,
There's biblical.
but that's,
Yeah.
I mean, I remember my high school biology teacher, that was one of the things he taught me. He talked about his most spiritual experience being in a rainforest, and he's like, I don't know where the 45 minutes went. I walked into this rain canopy, and all of a sudden people were coming and getting me, and it had been 45 minutes, and I don't know where it went. And for me, that led me on a path of understanding, no, the sacred is not in just necessarily these four walls. The sacred is much further than that. And if we're going to take his creation seriously, that's part of it.
Speaking of where did the 45 minutes go?
Oh,
We're coming
really?
upon that pretty soon, if not already there. And we could talk for hours, and we will continue to talk because
Yes.
God is calling us to talk and to action, which is the big thing.
Through
So
relationship.
you've got a prayer for us to close on.
Too. Jim Boyce taught at the seminary when I was there many, many years ago, and he taught a really unlikely part of seminary education that I had to struggle with, but finally got through, and that was learning Greek. But he also is the theological editor now of God Pause, that's online, that brings a whole bunch of community of faith people together to write daily devotions. He did the devotions last week, and Saturday, at the end of his devotion, this was the prayer, and I think it has a lot to say to us about growing young and about who we are as God's people. Gracious God, we thank you for the extravagant gifts that surround us in your wondrous creation, and for the wisdom and courage to use those gifts wisely in love and care of each other and of all creation. Amen.
Amen.